Welcome to the Rob Call Bottomup show, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, at opednews.com/podcasts, on iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud. My guest for this show is Jeff Weaver. He was Bernie's campaign manager for the presidential election, and he's a longtime advisor to Bernie. He's now senior political advisor to Bernie Sanders, and he's author of the book, How Bernie Won: Inside the Revolution That's Taking Back Our Country and Where We Go From Here. So welcome to the show. So great to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book, and you go into all these details. It's a kind of in some ways painful, because it brings back some painful memories of some of the nonsense that went on. But it's really illuminating, and I really like the way you wrap up the book with your vision of where things need to go. So what was your goal for this book?
Well, the goal for my book really was to a couple of things. One was to obviously tell the story of the campaign itself. And as you point out, there are a lot of interesting details about what was going on in the campaign when. And I think for a lot of people who were involved in the campaign or were watching the campaign, it will be an interesting look sort of behind the curtain in terms of the decision-making that was going on, the difficulties we were facing at various times, and, some of the triumphs that we had along the way. I also wanted to put the race in a historical context so that people, understand it as more than just a contest between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, that there is, a history to the Democratic Party in this country, and how this race fit into that history. Third, I wanted to give people a little sense of Bernie Sanders as a person. I've worked with him most of my adult life, started working with him in 1986. And, a lot of people see Bernie, the candidate, the fiery speaker and what have you. And I wanted to give folks a little sense of who Bernie Sanders is as a person. And finally, I wanted to, as you pointed out, talk a little bit about how I think the Democratic Party and the progressive movement can go forward successfully in taking back the country from the far right that is taking it over now.
Great. So first, the title of the book is How Bernie Won. How did Bernie win?
Well, how Bernie won, if you'll recall that when he started the campaign in a quickly called press conference outside the U.S. Senate on April 30th in 2015, he was talking about a lot of crazy ideas, Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage, demographic change, and a host of other issues, which at the time were thought to be fringe issues. He was at 3% in the polls. And the establishment really was not all that concerned about Bernie Sanders or the people who were supporting him. But what happened is just this incredible outpouring of support from one end of the country to the other. And we could talk a little about the various ways that manifested itself during the campaign. Almost immediately, gigantic crowds everywhere, thousands and then tens of thousands ultimately of people. People coming into the political process who had not previously participated, a huge outpouring of grassroots fundraising support, which allowed the campaign to go toe-to-toe with the Clinton administration, the Clinton campaign. Now you look at the political climate, you see a lot of new people running for office, a lot of people with a very progressive outlook running for office, many successful. You look at the platform of the Democratic Party. We haven't quite got Medicare for all in there yet, but certainly $15 minimum wages in there. By the end of the campaign, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton had come together around a program of free tuition at public colleges and universities, which was a major plank of his campaign. And so really the entire political dialogue has changed. The grassroots is energized in part by the campaign, and then, in part by other social and political movements that are going on right now. The women's movement, certainly the movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement around immigrant rights, and a host of others, are really changing the politics in this country to mirror the topic of the show. The name of the show really mirrors a bottom-up approach to politics. So in that sense, Bernie Sanders really did win the election. and has changed modern American politics for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so you used my buzzword. That's the name of the show,
Yes.
Bottomup Radio. So talk more about this bottom-up politics and how it's changed.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, when the campaign was first announced, we were very leanly staffed by the end of July. So he announced at a press conference at the end of April, Bernie did. And by the end of July, we had 28 staff, and that included headquarters staff and a few staff in Iowa and New Hampshire. Hillary Clinton by that time had literally hundreds and hundreds of staffers. And we had to deal with an outpouring of grassroots support. People were calling from all over the country, tell us what we can do to help Bernie. What do you want us to do? And the truth of the matter is that we just did not have the organizational capacity at that point. We developed it later on to mobilize folks around the country. And so our instruction to people was to self-organize and to do what they thought was going to be most helpful to the campaign. And it was the sort of flowering of local and grassroots efforts was amazing. Some people held house parties. Some people organized, went to farmers markets. Some people went door to door. Some people were, organized around local, holiday parades, whether it was, Memorial Day parades or July 4th parades, Labor Day parades. So you just saw this incredible outpouring of not just grassroots enthusiasm, but also people taking it upon themselves to organize locally and to advocate for the campaign without any direction at all at that point from the national headquarters. And, by the end of the campaign, we had become more structured. We had a distributed organizing campaign, really tapped into thousands and thousands and thousands of people who from their living room could access phone numbers of folks either in their own state or in other states and call them up and talk about why they were supporting Bernie. There was a tremendous use of social media, obviously, and tools, texting tools like Hustle, which we used to organize for rallies. After the Madison rally early in the summer of 2015, it was the first rally. We had 10,000 people. And after that rally, we never had to pay for any kind of advertising for Bernie's rally. We primarily relied on Hustle and also other social media tools, which drove out tens and tens of thousands of people. In some cases, rallies got to be 30,000 people. And that was all driven without any paid advertising whatsoever. So,
now, you basically just said that you handed a lot of the campaign over to the grassroots, and that there's a lot of trust in that. And it almost seems like an anathema to the kind of tight control that the DNC puts on its candidates generally.
Well, I think that is right. I don't want to come off as a saint here. It was in some ways a product of necessity. We were just not in a position to mobilize people. Certainly not the number of people who were coming out in all across this big country. And we did as we went along, and we were able to develop organizational capacity. We did provide people with activities, more structured activities that they could engage in. But large groups of people still continue to do self-organization around the country. And it was an incredible thing to see when you went from place to place. There was, we had obviously official campaign merchandise, Bernie T-shirts and mugs and the whole bumper stickers. But the incredible outpouring of creativity from the artistic community around the country. I mean, if you go online and just look at Bernie T-shirts, there are a zillion, designs. Some of them are extremely beautiful. We had a lot of art sent by artists to the campaign headquarters. And as long as somebody wasn't directly knocking off our official merchandise, we didn't, we had no problem with people taking it upon themselves to use their own artistic talents to support the campaign in that way. And that's just another example of the sort of grassroots energy and enthusiasm. I know people who have, collections of Bernie T-shirts from around the country. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. Many of them, quite beautiful.
So Bernie, would say at almost every single one of his rallies that change doesn't happen from the top down, it happens from the bottom on up. How did you use that idea in guiding the campaign?
Well, you know, a campaign is an interesting structure because it is, if you're successful, a massive startup which has a termination date, right? Very few organizations set up so quickly and are gone, you know, so quickly, whether they're successful or not. I mean, the election comes and the campaign is over. But we knew very early on that given the kind of support we were getting around the country, and the fact that we were fighting against the entire establishment, that we were going to have to rely on the excitement and enthusiasm that we were seeing at the grassroots, and that we were going to have to rely on really what is in truth one of the most effective political tools out there, which is people talking to their neighbors about why they're supporting one candidate or another. That happens, you know, there's been a lot of research obviously around politics and what's most effective in persuading voters and what have you. And it turns out that good old-fashioned neighbor-to-neighbor conversations really are the single most effective tool. And we relied on that extensively throughout the campaign. We went toe-to-toe with hard dollar money against the Clinton campaign, although they had the advantage of a super PAC and some other organizations supporting them. But and particularly early on, we were able to do all the traditional things that campaigns do, television advertising, internet advertising, leafleting, mail, so on and so forth, and radio. We did all of that. But there were many cases, we got more to the end of the campaign when the money was tighter, and those grassroots networks became even more important. I think of Kentucky, and in Kentucky, we were outspent on TV 2-1. Bernie did a bunch of events there. Hillary Clinton, in fact, spent a lot of time there. And we came within 1,800 votes of winning. South Dakota, we didn't do any television advertising. We came within 1,200 votes of winning. But that was because we had such an extensive people-to-people system set up. Those contests were later in the process. And by then, we had very well established these sort of grassroots networks and distributed organizing that was really helping to carry the campaign at that point, even as, it became more and more clear that Secretary Clinton was going to secure enough delegates to lock up the nomination.
Now, you've used that term distributed organizing a couple times. What do you mean by that?
So distributed organizing, in a traditional campaign, and again, we did all of this. So, in a traditional campaign, for instance, the Iowa caucus is the first contest in the presidential campaign. So you go into Iowa and you have paid staff, obviously, and then you have volunteer networks in the state. And then, particularly early on, when there's a lot of excitement, enthusiasm, you'll have people actually who come from other states to help out and volunteer as well. I mean, I know one group of folks from Florida, a bus of 50 people showed up in Iowa from Florida. They were self-organized. They were like, we're going to go to Iowa to help Bernie. And they rented a bus and they came to Iowa. And then what happens is the Iowa caucuses happen. And then, the contest moves to New Hampshire. And in most cases, all the people in Iowa who've been energized and working on the campaign are just left, sort of left behind, and the campaign is over there. But what we wanted to do was to give people in either in states where the primaries and caucuses had already happened, or in states that were far, ahead in the calendar, an opportunity to participate as well. And so we developed a lot of tools on the campaign, web tools. So for instance, folks could sit in your living room at your computer, and then a list of names would come up. And you were trained, and there was a script, and you could call people. And if you were, say, in California, which is at the end of the process, we had a lot of volunteers in California, you could call into whatever the next state happened to be on the calendar, Michigan or Illinois or whatever was coming up. And you could participate as a volunteer in that way. Also, when we had get out the vote efforts, you could make get out the vote calls, even if you were not in the state in which you were located. And in this way, you could mobilize a large grassroots national network to have impact in a certain state, even if it was not the state in which the person was living.
I did that. I actually tapped into that and did it for at least the state of Ohio. Maybe I forget whether I did it for others, but I certainly did it in Ohio. I was calling in using that technology. It was pretty.
Yeah, it's very powerful technology. You know, the Obama campaign had done a lot of groundbreaking work in this area as well. I know the Howard Dean people tried to do a little earlier, but you know, as technology improves, you remember Howard Dean used the Meetup platform as a big tool when he was running. But as technology has improved, you know, you can become more and more effective in using this kind of grassroots peer-to-peer, you know, sort of peer-to-peer communications. And also, you know, texting, there's a texting app called Hustle, which we used, and folks may or may not know that you cannot sort of spam text people. You can't just put in a list of numbers of people's phone numbers into a program and then send them sort of robo-text. That's not allowed under the law unless someone specifically gives you permission to text them. You can't bulk text them. So how do you get around that problem? Well, if you have a lot of people who support you, so some people would sit in their living room and send texts. You would just sit there and text individually people on their phones. And that was, as I mentioned before, that was one of the ways that we created that tremendous turnout at all of the events that Bernie was holding. But that was done with peer-to-peer texting, which means, you know, huge numbers of volunteers individually texting people who lived in that geographic area. So that was another way in which we really used a bottoms-up approach to political organizing.
So those are technological. Did Bernie basically provide input on his ideas about bottom-up and how it would be applied in the campaign?
Yeah, so Bernie, as you mentioned, Bernie said at every speech, you know, change always happens from the bottom up, not from the top down. And what he wanted the campaign to do, you know, beyond obviously winning the nomination, which was the primary goal, but was to inspire and empower people so that people understood. You know, a lot of times people feel down in politics because they feel like there's a lot of stuff happening, Washington, D.C., or in their state capital or somewhere else. They don't feel connected to it. They don't really feel that political leaders often are speaking to the realities of their life or what's happening in their community. And so they become separated from it. And he really wanted to get people engaged and to understand that they can, in fact, make a difference, you know, whether they participate in politics locally or at the state level or, you know, in national politics, you know, congressional elections, that, in fact, you know, people can get involved. They can change the direction of the country. But it takes really this sort of mass, organic, sort of grassroots uprising. And I think you're seeing a lot of that now, frankly.
I agree. So
he also wanted, you know, he's a big proponent of public financing of elections. And the reason he supports that position, which he articulates quite often, is that he wants us to be in a situation where somebody can run for office based on the merits of their ideas and not just on whether they have a lot of money themselves or whether they have friends, you know, a sufficient number of friends to put together the financing for their campaign. And that's, you know, that's all too often our reality. And you're seeing that now, even with all of these progressive candidates running in Democratic primaries around. Many of them are being successful, but in many cases we are seeing that, you know, they're being heavily outspent. And, you know, the truth of the matter is that politics does take money, and, you know, being outspent 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1, 10 to 1, 100 to 1 really hurts your chances, to say the least.
So there's so much interesting material in this book, and we only have a limited amount of time. And on top of that, I posted in a couple places that I was going to be interviewing you, and did my kind of bottom-up thing, asking my readers and friends to suggest questions for you. One of the places was a Democratic group in my county. And so the big question everybody has, is Bernie going to run in 2020? And
right. Well, I get that question quite often, as a matter of fact. And you know, the last 3 words of the book are "Run, Bernie, run." And so my position on this is quite clear. I do think that at this historical moment, he is the best candidate to take on Trump and to defeat Trump and to take back the White House for Democrats. That's I'm not shy about that view. That's my view. I know other people may disagree, but that's my view on it. He has not decided whether to run or not. He is actively looking at it, but I think at the appropriate time he will. He is very, very focused on the midterm elections as it happens. He has been traveling the country, supporting Democratic candidates. He was just in Pennsylvania and around a lot of social movements as well. He's going to be out in California talking to workers at Disney who are abysmally underpaid. He's going to be meeting and rallying with union folks for fair wages, and then he is going to be doing a very important rally on criminal justice reform and dealing with the systemic racism that we find in the criminal justice system. So he is very active. He's around the country, all over the place, but he's very focused on the midterms and taking back the Congress from the Republicans.
Cool. So you've known Bernie since you were in your 20s. And
1986 I met Bernie in 1986.
So I guess I met Bernie when he was in the House of Representatives. I don't know, maybe 2004, 2006, something like that. And for about 8 years, his staff used to post his articles routinely to my website, opednews.com. Are you familiar with it?
I am not, but I will talk to them about that.
Yeah, and
I see them occasionally. Yes.
And I got to know what was his chief guy, Mike Briggs, was it?
Michael Briggs. Michael Briggs was his communications director in the Senate, and then during the presidential campaign, left the Senate office to do it full time on the campaign.
Yeah, and I had a pretty good connection with him, but it's harder to get in touch with Bernie now. I mean, Bernie, you've known him for all that time. How has he stayed the same, and how has he changed? I mean, I'm friends with Tom Hartman too, and Bernie used to be on his show regularly. I mean, I think it was like lunch with Bernie every Friday for many years.
Yeah. Brunch with Bernie or lunch with Bernie. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, that was in Tom has a great show. Yeah, but Bernie really enjoyed that. My
question is, you know how he stayed the same, and somehow, some ways he changed. I mean, he's now the most popular active politician in the world, from what I understand, right?
Well, I've seen polling in the U.S. which confirms that. I don't know about the world, but he certainly is the most active political leader in the country. So, and he does. There are a lot more demands on his time. I mean, one of the things that he has had to adapt to, particularly since the success of the presidential campaign, is just the tremendous number of demands on his time. There are a lot of folks reaching out all across the country. I'm just not talking necessarily about media folks, but people who are involved in political movements or who are candidates for office. He could work 90 hours a day and still not keep up with all of it. So there has been a lot more juggling since the nation sort of rallied to him in 2016. But in many ways, Bernie and I used to travel around Vermont and just the two of us going from place to place. He ran for governor in '86, got 14% of the vote. And, we would go to meetings with 5 people or 10 people. If he had 10 people, that was a pretty good meeting. And he always loved, and he still loves, which is why the rallies were such an important part of his presidential campaign. He likes talking to people face to face more than anything else. And so, he wanted during the presidential campaign to make sure that he was out there and that people could see him in the flesh and that they could hear him, unfiltered by the media. And so that's why he held those rallies. And again, in some cases, New York City, over 30,000 people, LA, over 30,000 people, Phoenix, 12,000 people. I mean, just people came out in droves. And, many in the media were skeptical at the beginning that folks who came out to these meetings or these rallies would actually come out and vote. But, as we saw, they certainly did.
Yeah, that's for sure. So how has he stayed the same? Tell me a little bit more. I mean, but all this great stuff has happened to him. What is consistent about Bernie today that was with him when you met him in your 20s?
Yeah, so there are a few things about, I'll talk about it on a couple different levels. So personally, he's very much the same. He has always been a person with this sort of boundless energy. I remember, in the old days, I lived about 30 miles north of Burlington where he lived. So I would pick him up at 7 in the morning and we would, travel around the state, and I would drop him off at, 11 or 12 o'clock at night, drive home. And then I'd be back at 7 o'clock in the morning picking him up. And we would do this for months and months and months at a time. And, I tell this story in the book, when we had downtime in the schedule, rather than sit around and do nothing, we would open the trunk of the car and pull out, I would hold a Bernie sign, and we would stand at the busiest intersection we could find, and he would wave at cars, for 45 minutes or an hour, 2 hours. And he's like that, today. It was interesting on the campaign when it first started. There were the reporters who travel with you tend to be younger reporters, and they all had these half-written stories ready to go about how Bernie, didn't have the energy to run or was too old or what have you. And, within a week, all of those stories were thrown in the trash because those 20-something-year-old reporters were all dragging, trying to keep up with Bernie's schedule. One of them asked me, when do we have lunch? When is lunch scheduled? And I said, sorry, Bernie doesn't eat lunch. He works through lunch. So if you want lunch, you better bring it.
And in the book, you talk about how you realized you had to book more events in certain states, and you went to Bernie to ask which ones should we cancel, and his response was, "We're just going to add more." I mean, the guy is a dynamo.
Right. Yeah, he said, "I'll just work harder next week." This was, in the lead up to, 5 big contests: Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri. And, we were moving in the polls in North Carolina. We were moving up, and so we wanted to add some events in North Carolina. And, the 3 of those states are next to each other, but the other 2 are not. And so there's quite a bit of travel in between. So he said, Bernie, we want you to do more events in North Carolina. And he said, great. I said, well, which ones should we pull down? That's in political terms, when you're canceling an event, you call it pulling down. Which one are you pulling down? And he said, none of them. I'll just work really hard next week. And by God, he did. So that's something about Bernie that has never changed. And the other thing, and I do have given my long association, a deep personal affection for Bernie. He has always been motivated by a desire to make politics work for regular people in every zip code. And that motivated him when I started working for him in 1986, and it still motivates him today.
Is that different than most politicians?
Look, it's difficult. You get elected to Congress, and I'm not here to beat up on every member of Congress. There are some great members of Congress. There's some that aren't so great, but there's a culture in Washington that is, and President Obama actually talked about this in his book. What happens to you when you just end up spending a lot of time in certain kinds of social circles and what have you, that you start to lose your connection with everyday people on the street. And Bernie has always tried to avoid that. He goes home. I mean, you can count on one hand the number of weekends he has spent in Washington. He's always going back to Vermont, or now increasingly on the road in other places. But he is always trying to go out and talk to real people and not lose that connections. But it's very easy to get lost in the morass of committee hearings and internal politics on the Hill and what have you, and to really lose your connection with regular people.
I think connection is a key part of a bottom-up way of doing things. And, when you look at the DNC and their policy for candidates, they basically say they want them to spend a huge percentage of their time making calls to raise money. I don't think Bernie did that or does that.
Well, he had the luxury of not having to do that. He made, I don't know that he made it in the presidential race, made any phone calls for money. And, that was largely driven by the fact that, people at the grassroots with their average contribution, everybody knows $27 average contribution, so generously supported the campaign and the message that he was taking across the country. I don't think anybody knew that that would be the case. I discussed in the book, one of the things that really limited us at the beginning was our lack of understanding of how generous the country would be. And we were, fiddling around with a $30 million budget, which in hindsight is a little bit ludicrous. A modern professional campaign for Senate in California is $50 million. So we were talking about a $30 million presidential campaign. And as it turned out, we raised over $230 million. And it came all in, small contributions. And it was incredible. And in that sense, when you talk about bottom up, it is the traditional way in politics is to call people who have a lot of money and ask for the $2,700 contributions, which is the federal cap for a federal race, and to try to aggregate as many of those as possible. In part because it's more efficient to call somebody and get $2,700 than it is to call somebody and get $27. But we really defied any kind of expectation, including our own, frankly, in that regard. And in that way, the campaign in 2016 really did change politics, because I'm not sure that candidates at all level can accomplish that, because you do have to break through the clutter of everybody's life. Everybody is very busy with not just politics, right? You're competing with work life and family life and people's favorite sports teams and TV shows and entertainment. And so people's lives are full of things that they have to do. And most people have more things in their life to do than they have time for. And so, breaking through as a political messenger is difficult if you are a little known candidate running for Congress in a Democratic primary somewhere. So that makes it much harder for a candidate like that to raise money the way that Bernie did. But certainly at the presidential level, he has shown that you can, in fact, run a grassroots-funded presidential campaign.
So I want to take a moment for an station ID and or show ID, and then we'll get back and talk a bit about some advice you have for people running now for this interim election and for 2020. This is the Rob Cole Bottomup show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher. And my guest for this show is Jeff Weaver. He was Bernie Sanders' campaign manager for the presidential campaign. He's a long-term advisor to Bernie, and he's now senior political advisor to Bernie Sanders. And he's the author of the book, How Bernie Won, Inside the Revolution That's Taking Back Our Country and Where We Go From Here. So what advice do you have to people who are now running for Congress, for local elections, for governor, for senator? What did you learn, and what have you learned working with Bernie and working in the 2016 presidential campaign that you can impart to them? What wisdom do you have to offer?
Well, wisdom may be overstating it, but I'll give it a shot. Look, my advice and I meet a lot of political candidates because they call me up, and I'm always happy to talk to Democratic candidates who are looking to run for office. And what I say to people is, you really have to be an authentic messenger of whatever message you're delivering. And I have views about what the most powerful message is at this particular time in our country's history. But aside from the substance of the message, you have to be who you are. And I think in our increasingly virtual world, people are looking more and more for leaders who are authentic. And there's one thing you can say about Bernie: he is authentic. I can't tell you how many Republicans I run into who recognize me from having been on TV during the presidential campaign, who say, I didn't really agree with your guy and all this stuff, but I got to tell you, I really feel like, he was saying it the way he believed it. And when Bernie runs for office in Vermont, he gets 25% of the Republican vote there, often rural Republicans. And you saw it also in the presidential primary campaign. In those states, and that's most states where independent voters can participate in the Democratic primaries and caucuses. Bernie won those voters, 4-1, 5-1, which is part of the reason, basically, essentially, why he would have been such a powerful general election candidate, because of his strong support among independent voters. But
you said you're certain that he would have won against Trump.
I'm very certain that he would have won against Trump. In fact, one of Trump's pollsters a couple of months ago said publicly that they were pretty confident that Bernie would have beaten them as well. So I don't, I mean, that's not a criticism of Secretary Clinton or any of her folks who, fought very hard. We fought alongside them in the general election. I was a press surrogate for Secretary Clinton at the St. Louis debate, general election debate. I was on TV quite a bit defending Secretary Clinton against Donald Trump. And Bernie was traveling the country from one end to the other, his typical, 3-4 rallies a day in support of the secretary. So it's not a criticism of that. I just think for a number of reasons, Bernie was a stronger general election candidate against Trump in 2016. There might have been another time in history where Secretary Clinton might have been the stronger candidate against Trump, but that was not 2016.
Tell us about your thoughts about the Democratic Party and Democratic Party consultants and the DNC and where they are now. I mean, I just saw that there's a poll that they had this huge lead with generic Democrat against generic Republican, and it looks like that's totally disappeared at this point.
Yeah, and I've seen some of that polling, and look, that polling is going to go up and down. I would not panic about that polling, in part for this reason. Even if the polling gets closer, what we have seen since the election of Trump, and it's really been everywhere. It's not confined to suburbs or cities or rural areas. I mean, it's really been everywhere. Is that the enthusiasm on the Democratic side is so much higher, and in midterms tend to be lower turnout elections. That's just empirically true. It's not a good thing, but it's true. And so I think that the enthusiasm that you're seeing on the Democratic side is going to allow Democrats to perform better than what the head-to-head polling is showing. So, I'm hopeful in that regard. And like I said, we've seen it everywhere. Some of the special elections we had, even the ones where we didn't win, in Montana, the Republican candidate there underperformed Trump by 20 points. Kansas, the 4th district in Kansas was the same. That's the home of the Koch brothers, the geographic home of the Koch brothers. But, the Republican candidate did 20 points less than Trump did there. There was a South Carolina race that the Democrats lost by a couple thousand votes. So we've seen it in place after place that even where Democrats haven't been able to quite get over the line, they have done much, much, much better than in the presidential election of 2016. So I am hopeful in that. In terms of the DNC and what have you, look, I try to put the campaign, the 2016 campaign, in historical context. The modern Democratic Party really was born in the New Deal era of FDR. His 1944 State of the Union address, which talks about the unfinished business of the country, which is basically a message of economic populism, talks about healthcare for all, talks about jobs for all. I mean, it's really an inspirational document, and is really represents to me, and I think many people, the unfinished business of the country and of the Democratic Party. And it was in many ways the foundational document of the modern Democratic Party, but we lost our way in the early 90s, with the Democratic Leadership Council and the election of Bill Clinton. The party really took an aberrational move to the right, which was really out of sync with its modern historical trajectory of a more inclusive party.
In your book, Jeff, in your book, you say the Democratic Party has lost the trust of tens of millions of voters in large swaths of the country, and you say adherence to a neoliberal agenda is killing the Democratic Party. Talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you have with the election of Bill Clinton in 1992, the NAFTA agenda, the free trade agreement agenda that he laid out, really severed, in many ways, the relationship and the trust between the Democratic Party and labor. 1994 was a devastating year for the Democrats. They lost the House of Representatives for the first time since the 50s. And what happened then is because sort of working people in the Democratic Party, there was this fissure between them that was caused, in part by the Clinton free trade agenda of NAFTA and others, the administration turned toward this really cynical triangulation policy against some of the most vulnerable members of the Democratic base, including communities of color, poor people, and the LGBT community, with DOMA, the welfare reform bill, and the crime bill, which led to much of the mass incarceration that we've seen to this day. And at that point, other constituencies of the Democratic Party started to lose faith in it as a vehicle for social change. And and I think that the 2016 race was really, in some ways, a fight by the grassroots to retake the party from the neoliberal wing of the party, which had dominated it, and in some ways still is trying to dominate it. I think Barack Obama started that effort to start to move the party in a new direction. His administration had to deal with just an incredible, financial calamity that threatened to bring down the world economic system. Not a big problem, but I say jokingly, but when you have to understand when Barack Obama took office, the challenge that he was facing, incredible, unbelievable, and so one can only imagine. He did some incredible things. He had a stimulus bill, although there were Democrats obviously who watered it down. He had the Affordable Care Act, which again some Democrats in the Senate watered down. But one can only imagine as much good as he did for the country, how much more good he could have done if he had come in without a world economic system about to collapse. So I think in many ways, the movement around Barack Obama was at the beginning of that stirring of the grassroots wanting to take the party back from the sort of aberrational or rightwards shift that the neoliberals represented. And I think that really was the foundational fight that went on in the 2016 presidential primary, was again the party trying to the grassroots trying to reassert itself, to return to that New Deal, those New Deal roots. And as I pointed out in the book, I think in many ways, if I think about a failing in terms of messaging on the campaign, was the fact that we did not more explicitly and consistently draw the connection between the policies that Bernie was advocating and those foundational policies which made the modern Democratic Party the success that it was for so many decades.
And you're talking about Roosevelt's change.
Yes, Franklin Roosevelt's 1944 State of the Union. It is it's in the book. My publishers said, no, you can't put that long quoted speech in the book. No one will read it. Single space, blah blah blah. I said, no, it has to go in. You in many ways you can't understand the 2016 race and the conflict that's going in within the Democratic Party and what people in the progressive wing, which is the wing of the party, which is increasingly becoming the whole bird. You can't understand what that is about without reading that document and understanding what FDR and many of his successors understood to be the unfinished business of the Democratic Party.
And you close your introduction to the book with an FDR quote. I'll read it. He says, "I like to think of our country as one home in which the interests of each member are bound up with the happiness of all. We ought to know by now that the welfare of your family or mine cannot be bought at the sacrifice of our neighbor's family."
No, that's right. And, I thought that quote was important for a number of reasons. One of which is the extent to which this current administration is trying to divide up America, by race, by religion, by gender, by sexual orientation or identity.
Wait, because the other thing you say in your book is that this is also what some of the power holders in the Democratic Party have been doing as well. I mean, you literally say that's a problem that you're already seeing. That look, when you talk about top down versus bottom up, bottom up is successful when
people recognize the commonality of their interests and work together to bring everybody up. And I talk about this as the challenge of the Democratic Party about how you build this type of coalition. And it's really, as I point out, if you look at polling and you talk to African American voters, Latino voters, or white voters, or whoever you talk to, the issues that people point out that are of concern to them are incredibly similar, right? People want to have a decent economic standing for their family. They want their children to have a good education. They don't want to be without health insurance. They want to live with social dignity. I mean, it is incredible, the sort of what I call the common aspirations of people in this country. Now, at the same time, we have to recognize that different communities face different barriers in trying to attain that set of common aspirations. So in some places, schools are great. Some places, schools are terrible. Some people are, subjected to systemic racism. Some people, face sexism. These are all the barriers that keep people from attaining these common aspirations. So I think we have to articulate a set of common aspirations that resonate with the American people. And at the same time, apropos what FDR is saying, we have to explain to people, and people get this, frankly, that we do recognize that different people in different communities and in different situations have different barriers that keep them from attaining these common aspirations. And we're going to tear down the barriers in all those communities so that each person can attain the type of happiness that FDR talked about in his State of the Union address. Now, I do detail in there have been times, and there are still times now, where some people attempt to exploit racial divisions and other divisions in this country for their own advantage, and I find it reprehensible. But the extent to which it has been institutionalized or attempting to be institutionalized by the Trump administration makes what's going on in the Democratic Party look like nothing, frankly. But I do agree with you, and I do point out instances in the book where people have attempted to exacerbate tensions and social fissures for their own advantage. And when we talk about Bill Clinton and the crime bill, it clearly played on racist notions. The welfare reform bill was, really in many ways a sort of copycat of the Reagan welfare queen line. And DOMA, the 1996 Bill Clinton reelection campaign ran ads on Christian radio in the South touting support for DOMA. So, this is the type of politics that people play when they don't have a connection, where they don't have that grassroots connection with people in this country, when they are not trying to build a common future that has a place for everybody.
You talk about how people need to be authentic. One of the things that I've done over the years is I coach candidates on how to identify the stories in their lives and use those stories to explain issues that they care about. Because I think that stories, when personal stories are tied to issues, it connects people's heart to heart. And that's a lot more powerful a way of connecting candidates to voters than ideas. And George Lakoff has complained that Democrats tend to be too academic, and I think there needs to be more of that.
Well, I could not agree with you more. I mean, I've said this in other places, so I'm not talking out of school here. But Bernie Sanders has, often been accused of being kind of reticent about talking about his personal life, and really just talking about, the intricacies of policy. And I think that's right. I think people want to hear more about what it is that in a candidate's life that motivates her or motivates him to take a certain position. I mean, you look. I mean, I've talked to a number of candidates who are running for Congress, who are very focused on the issue of Medicare for all, and in a number of those cases, it is a reflection of real tragedy that they have faced in their life, either a family member who died because they couldn't access medical care or sufficient medical care, or tremendous financial burden that their family faces as a result of having to pay for expensive medical procedures. And I think those stories are very powerful for voters, because voters, we talk about authenticity, you can do a poll and you can find out what everybody, the majority of people in your district think about this or that, the other thing. And then you can go out and run TV commercials, which, say you share those views. That doesn't really count for much with voters. Exactly what you were talking about is what you have to do. You have to connect yourself with something real in your life that lets voters know that you're authentic.
Okay, so we need to do another station ID. This is the Rob Call Bottomup Show, sponsored by opednews.com. Available on Pacifica Radio and Progressive Radio Network and iTunes and SoundCloud and Stitcher. And my guest for this show is Jeff Weaver. He was the Bernie Sanders campaign manager for the presidential election. He is the senior political advisor to Bernie Sanders, and he's the author of the book, How Bernie Won, Inside the Revolution That's Taking Back Our Country and Where We Go From Here. So a couple more questions. What about our revolution? What's happening with that, and how's that going, and how is that connecting in with Bernie and with politics today?
Right. So I was at Our Revolution. I left Our Revolution in 2017. So I'm not sort of over there. It's Ohio former Senator Nina Turner is the head of Our Revolution. And they are doing some very important work around the country, supporting candidates, particularly candidates lower down the ballot, and with some incredible success. I think they're almost 50% of the candidates they're supporting are getting elected. People will be like, "Wow, that's not even half." Well, let me tell you, when you were out supporting progressive candidates, in sometimes difficult races against well-funded opponents, both in general elections and in primaries, that kind of success rate actually is pretty impressive. They are, we talked about distributed organizing a little while ago. That's one of the things that they do quite well. The mobilized members, they have 600 local chapters. And not only are they working on electing candidates, but they are also working to help folks democratize state Democratic parties around the country, letting people know. A lot of people don't think about running for public office, but they don't know that most senior positions in the Democratic Party, at the state level and other places those are elected positions, right? What is the process for running for a Democratic Party position? How do you, what are the rules? How do you organize? So on and so forth. So these things don't get a lot of attention, but they're extremely important. And so they're having some of the outcomes over there are very, very good. And
you say something interesting in your book. You say, I know what can come out of an unsuccessful campaign. And you're kind of framing that as positives that can come out of it. So talk a little bit.
Look, absolutely. So I was with Bernie in the early days. So I worked on a 1986 gubernatorial campaign where he got 14% of the vote. I worked on his 1988 congressional campaign where he lost by three percentage points. And then, he was finally elected to Congress in 1990 by well over double digits against the Republican who had beat him 2 years earlier. And so what I saw then, and I was obviously deeply disappointed. When I talk to people now who are so deeply disappointed about the outcome of the 2016 Democratic presidential primary, I get it, because I was young, I was enthusiastic, I was idealistic, I was all in for Bernie, and we lost. We ran hard, we had great campaign, and we lost. But what came out of that was a future success. And what has come out of 2016 and how Bernie won, the question, that you started with, how Bernie won. If you look at the number of people running, I'm tied in with what we call the Bernie staff alumni, all the people who worked on the campaign. And, at our peak, we had 1,200 paid staff and canvassers around the country. So, we had a big campaign at our peak. And I look around and I look at a lot of the contests that you see in the news, or people get solicitations from. How many of the alumni of Bernie's 2016 race are working on these other campaigns. And that is in truth, a valuable contribution to our democratic process to have so many young, and many not so young, folks who had their first introduction in politics on Bernie's 2016 campaign, came away with a lot of not just enthusiasm, but a lot of technical knowledge, which then can go to help other future candidates. So, that's just another, contribution in addition to the great strides we've made in the policy debate in this country and the fact that so many progressives are winning.
Okay, so a couple people asked me, I got to ask you this question. In
Sure.
Arizona and in New York, there were some pretty clear signs that people were disenfranchised. They were told when they went to vote that they were not registered as Democrats. And I mean, in New York, it amounted to at least 100,000 people. I mean, and there was never any legal effort to right this. What's the story there? Any comments on that?
Well, yes. I mean, there were, and this is a great debate, what it was called the open primary versus closed primary debate, whether people should have to register as Democrats to participate in the Democratic primary process or whether we should allow independents to participate. In most states, independents can, in fact, participate. And, there are the 20 states that don't even have party registration. I'm sitting here in Northern Virginia, there's nobody here registered as a Democrat or Republican or anything else. Same in Vermont and the same in a lot of places. But there are places where you have these party registration rules. And what is sad about it, and let's talk about Arizona and New York in a second, but increasingly young people independents and not as either Democrats or Republicans. And that is in part because people in the millennial generation have a different relationship with institutions, political institutions or religious institutions or economic institutions than I think those of us who are a little older do. And to lock them out of the Democratic primary process, to essentially say, we don't want to hear from you, even though we know that we desperately voters in the general election, but to say we don't want you involved in the primary process is pretty incredible, and it's going to result in us having an older and smaller Democratic Party. Specifically around Arizona, there is no place, and we talk about New York too, but there's no place in the country where more people were disenfranchised in such a systemic way than happened in the Arizona Democratic presidential primary. They had chopped, the number of voting locations to a fraction of what it had been the time before. Communities of color were in particular disenfranchised. The voting rolls were in such horrendous shape that people found their voter registration changed. People who had voted, who had been registered Democrats for years and years and years, went and were told they were independents. Independents showed up to vote in the primary to be told that they couldn't participate, which was in fact the rule. But their confusion was understandable, given that for every other office in Arizona, the primaries are open to independent voters, but not the presidential primary. The lines were so long, people literally waited 5 or 6 hours to vote. The stories of people who went before work, but had to leave to go to work, came at lunch, had to leave to go back to work, came after work, stood for hours. The kids are at home, they have to leave. It was an embarrassment. And when we talk about, countries with terrible election systems, disenfranchising people and what have you, no place was worse than Arizona.
And what you point out in the book is that this was an election that was pretty much controlled by a Republican-controlled state. So the Republicans inflicted this on the Democrats who were voting.
Yeah, no, that's right. And this has happened all across the country. In Arizona, obviously, it manifested itself in the most overt way.
One more important thing, you say in the book that this idea of protecting the Democratic vote because of crossover voting has been proven not to be a real issue. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'd love to see open primaries everywhere, but the argument is, there's the crossover vote.
Yeah, there has been. Look, I spent most of my life in Vermont, where in the old days in Vermont, in the quote unquote old days, you know, in most places where they have open primaries, you have to go in and say, I want a Democratic ballot or I want a Republican ballot. If you're an independent voter, and you can vote that ballot. You know, in Vermont, they used to hand you, there was a third party, which was considered a major party in Vermont. They would hand you all three ballots and you voted one and you put the other two in the discard box. So no one even knew what primary you voted in. There is no case, and no one has demonstrated to me yet that there is one, in a large-scale election with a major party where some kind of strategic crossover voting has resulted in the change in the outcome. It just does not happen. You know, there's always discussion that, oh, the Republicans are going to come in and create mischief, or the Independents are going to come in. You know, and again, when I talk about open primaries, I'm talking primarily about allowing independent voters to participate as opposed to Republicans. But even in those places where Republicans are allowed to choose one ballot or another at the time of the election, there's no evidence that I have seen, and believe me, I'm sure people would present it if there were, where there was some kind of massive strategic voting effort that was successful in somehow turning the outcome of a Democratic primary. Just as a practical matter, doesn't happen.
Down to the last couple minutes here, you say the Titanic may be going down, but as long as the establishment have the first class cabins, everything's okay. You're talking about Democrats there. Talk a little bit about that.
I am. Look, I mean, it is empirically true, and hopefully 2018 will begin the reversal of that. It is empirically true that we have lost 1,000, if you count state legislative seats, over 1,000 seats since 2010. To say that there's not a problem ignores what is an objective reality. And we cannot allow the Republicans to dominate state legislatures, the Congress, now the White House, and governor's mansions around this country. The party needs to reorient itself to reestablish faith with people in all the communities where that faith has been broken, and to rebuild the type of coalition that made our party successful, beginning with the New Deal era for decades. And you know, if people go back and look at speeches or even film reels from that time period, FDR was at war basically with a lot of the establishment of the Democratic Party at that time. And it's going to take breaking a few eggs to make this omelet. And that's what's going on now, and I hope it continues.
Anything you want to wrap up with in terms of advice to people running for office, people who are thinking about it, people who just want to be a part of the process?
Yeah, what I would tell people is that politics, I know people, this is a little bit trite, but politics is not a spectator sport. You have got to get out and vote, particularly in these elections where they're local elections, small turnout elections. Even a few people organizing can have a tremendous, tremendous impact. And so I would say, look around you, look what's happening in this country. Progressive people are running, progressive people are winning. The conversation has been changed. And I encourage everyone to be a part of that.
You've offered a very hopeful view for the political future with your book. I've been speaking with Jeff Weaver. He's the senior political advisor to Bernie Sanders. He was the campaign manager for the presidential campaign and is the author of a new book, How Bernie Won: Inside the Revolution That's Taking Back Our Country and Where We Go From Here. Jeff, thanks so much for doing this interview.
Oh, it was my pleasure, really.